Welcome to New Rechts, or for English listeners, New Right. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today we're going to talk about, you could say, what they call the culture war, but more what does it actually mean in the West nowadays with identity, with claims about racism. And it's kind of a topic that, as I was just already saying before the conversation, it's not talked about a lot in the Netherlands on all sides. So I'm happy to have this discussion. And yeah, to have this discussion, I'm happy to talk to Ada Akbala. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Very excited about the conversation.
Yeah, so you are someone who talks and writes a lot about these topics, but maybe for our listeners, you can introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, so I was born in Nigeria. I live in the UK now. I came here about 25 years ago. But my family ties to the UK goes way back. So my grandfather, he was a business professor in Nigeria, and he came to the UK to kind of collaborate on a project with one of the universities here, University of Cardiff. So that meant that my dad was born here. But in my dad's adult years, he was sort of back and forth between Nigeria and here. And so that's what led us to be here sort of permanently as time went by. But my family sort of background really plays a significant role in shaping my worldview today. Both my parents have been heavily involved in enterprise, in business pursuits. So that's always given me this kind of sense of hard work and self-reliance and the importance of sort of opportunity, right? And not sort of waiting for a savior or an external savior to come help you. And I feel like this perspective really drives me to speak about certain things I'm seeing today in the cultural climate. So I do see a shift away from that individual agency and fortitude and personal responsibility. And we're moving toward more a focus on victimhood and, you know, that collectivism, right? And
Exactly.
I've always had a keen interest in understanding the complexities of, you know, culture, politics, human behavior. Not really sure what sparked this. I've spent a lot of time looking into history, philosophy, sociology, and so on. And it really helps me when it comes to analyzing a lot of contemporary issues. I'm also the head of content for a charity here called the Equiana Project. So this is an initiative that really focusing on creating, you know, conversations, meaningful conversations about race, identity, history. And I've had the privilege of contributing to a lot of the narratives, you know, around issues here that are often quite difficult to discuss, but important nonetheless. Sure. Yeah.
That's a great point. I'm quite curious then, what do you think was the experience of your family when they came to the UK? Was it pleasant? You said they were kind of business focused, but from this cultural and this, let's say, element on potential racism, how did your family experience this?
So the interesting thing is, my family, especially more my father, he never really went into detail about what he experienced here in the UK and the racism that he experienced here, which I think it speaks to two things. One, he wanted me to sort of have firsthand experience of how life will be in the UK. And he didn't lead me to have preconceptions of, you know, a place being against me, this kind of talk and narratives that happens here sometimes. But I know through sort of conversations that we've had in my adult years that he did face some difficulty, but more in terms of maybe being an outsider rather than not being able to have opportunities. I mean, he's been project managers for, you know, local councils. So whatever racism he may have faced in terms of maybe a comment here or a comment there didn't really stop him when it came to the real things that mattered. But like I said, in my own country, we were fairly privileged in a sense. I know a Black person can't say that they were privileged, but we were. So it was a water of a duck's back, anything that they experienced here. And like I said, that's why I feel it wasn't on the forefront of their minds when they spoke about the UK.
It's a fair point. It always matters what you focus on in life, right? There are a lot of things that can happen, and there can even be some, like you said, racist comments happening. But what you do with it, that's up to yourself. And I'm also quite curious then, what has been your experience in your own life with this?
Yeah, just before I talk about that, I think that's a very important point that we need to talk about more, the kind of language and stories we tell our children when it comes to, you know, specifically racism. But I know, because obviously I speak with a lot of Black people, and I know that there's this tendency to be so focused on what society says and what society thinks, you know, and it's like, for example, a concrete example, well, the beauty standards don't favor Black people or so on. And this is why I feel insecure, or this is why I'm not getting certain roles in media industry. And it's like, well, what did you hear from your own inner circle? If you really think that the society thinks you're ugly, what were your own inner community telling you? And I'm saying that to say, didn't matter what I faced outside, right? I always had that strong community support, strong network of people who believed in themselves and believed in their talents, believed in their vision. And that was what drove me. And that's why nothing has ever stopped me from achieving what I've always wanted to achieve, right? So, yes, I have had the odd comments, you know, from white people. It could be about the color of my skin. It could be about my culture coming from Africa. But funnily enough, I have had the same comments, the exact same comments, and sometimes even worse from people who look exactly like me, right? But maybe are not Nigerian. Maybe they're also, maybe they're from the Caribbean. Maybe they were born in the UK, and they find my cultural ways and habits strange, right? They think how I speak might be strange. I've been told that I don't sound like a Black girl on so many occasions. And I am not the only Black girl that will tell you this, right? So it's funny when people ask me about racism, I'm like, which one? From who?
It's that's a very good point to add, I would say. And like, for me, for example, maybe to say something a little bit controversial, but like, I have a Jewish background, and of course, Jewish people tend, I think, in some ways, rightfully so, also to focus on like anti-Semitism and discrimination, etc. And it is growing in Europe, so I cannot say that there's no worry there. But I would say there maybe is a similarity in the fact that there is sometimes a little bit too much of a victim mentality of things that happened in the past, which were terrible. But for your own life, I agree, you need to also look what are the things you're going to do with these negativity. Either it can be from people from your own background, like you're saying, or someone who might have even have resentment or whatnot. It's the question is if you will let yourself down or not with that.
As long as there are no legal laws, legislation to stop me from getting a job, getting a home, right? We are fine. But in terms of these abstract things like implicit bias and microaggressions, these intangible things that really is just sort of an excuse to expand the scope of racism, because it seems that racism has dwindled altogether, then I think we're fine. I think we're fine.
I think that's a good stepping stone. If we zoom out a little bit into why is this being talked about now, I feel almost, especially coming from the American first, like I think this became again with like the Black Lives Matter, this became a very big topic once again. Growing up in the Netherlands, I never felt there was the amount of racism that's being talked about nowadays, and I feel like all of a sudden it became a huge issue again. And of course, if there's racism, that should always be talked against. But why do you think that this issue became, in many Western countries, once again such a hot topic?
I think the idea of racism today is a convenient tool for polarization, because it creates that binary narrative, where certain groups are either oppressors or oppressed, right? So this binary is really amplified by the culture war, right? Where sort of racism is often used to create this moral agency and fuel ideological battles, right? Politicians and activists on both sides, they use the idea of racism to either solidify their base or demonize the other side, right? On the left, you have something like racism being framed as, systemic, and there's always calls for policies to redress historical wrongs and address inequality in policing, in healthcare, in housing, education. So there's this strong focus of trying to right certain disparities. And like you mentioned, yes, racism exists. It's here. It needs to be talked about. But I think how the direction of the conversation is very false, very misleading, right? And to now reframe racism from being, this vile attitude that you can have towards someone who is not from your particular group, to now mean any disparities that exist in society that unfavors ethnic minorities, I think it's completely wrong. So I think it's a power play as well, particularly from people of the left that are trying to use racism to perhaps reshape certain things in the modern West.
Yes, it almost feels to me like racism indeed is used as a tool, and if there is no racism, then it needs to be invented or needs to be looked somewhere. It's a funny anecdote was last week I saw that there was this person from the government who is one of the central people in the Netherlands who is, I guess, assisting local governments with fighting racism. And he got asked the question, what if there's just not a lot of people complaining about racism in, for example, in a town? He says that means that right there's something wrong because there needs to be racism. Already, if there are people there living there, by definition, there needs to be racism. And that's a kind of, it feels like that's what's going on a bigger scale as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is the kind of Robin DiAngelo kind of, I'm sure your listeners should be aware of these kinds of people. That's the kind of thought pattern, right? It's not about whether racism exists, is about how it exists, and you need to sort of find it out. And it's just such a wrong attitude, a wrong way to go through life. It's like anything else. We don't teach our kids, young people, to look for the bad in life, right? And that's what we're literally making an exception for racism. No, look for what way you may have been slighted in a situation. Was it a look? Was it a way that someone didn't say hi, or someone said hi in the wrong way? So like you mentioned, we've expanded the definition, right? Dictionaries have changed definitions, which means that we've expanded the scope of what racism means. And this also means there's no end point to this all. I know here and maybe in the US, there are sort of talks that woke is dead and so on. But yes and no. No, in terms of when we reach progress, when we sort of, it wasn't like in the 60s and 70s where progress actually meant something. Civil rights in America, in the UK actually meant something. No, now progress now means, okay, what else can we quickly find and jump on, so that, like I said, for political and financial power, because people have seen that this is a good thing to capitalize on, because you're able to grip the emotions of people, whether that's so-called ethnic minorities telling them that they're hated by the societies that they live in, or whether that's instilling guilt in the so-called majority group, right? And then there's that constant, it appeals to our human nature, right? We don't want to be racist. We don't want people to suffer, right? Intrinsically. And I think it's sad that this is being weaponized for these purposes.
Exactly. And I think you made a very good point here, which is that you said when they actually had the civil rights movements, then progress did mean something. I mean, if you look at Martin Luther King and stuff, like they were talking about color blindness as much as you can, right? We're all imperfect people, but this should be at least the goal. And I feel like over the last few years, actually, if you say that you are for color blindness, which was basically what the civil rights movements all across the West were about, it feels like now then you are also labeled a racist for some reason.
It's very frustrating. We've regressed so much. And like you said, these very noble principles. That's why I don't like to use the word hate, but I hate this radical leftist mentality, right? I've used all the culture war buzzwords, but I really do, because it's like these ideals that our so-called ancestors really dreamed to reach, we've literally just thrown it all out the window. Color blindness is now racist. Individual agency that our forefathers so-called fought for, you know, to have that individual autonomy, is now racist, right? Everything that is sort of white is bad. Everything that is not white is good, right? Slavery done by the Arabic nations, African nations, well, they did it because of white people. So there is no moral agency. You know, moral agency, the value that Black people, you know, really fought for in time past to be recognized as having, to be recognized as being, to be seen more than, you know, animals at that time, to be seen as equal human beings. We are here now, but then you have the leftists saying, no, we are not here. If a criminal who is not white commits a crime, it's not their fault. You know, it's because of their surroundings. So we're back to that. Actually, they have no individual, you know, moral capacity to make decisions and act, right? So that's just an example of how frustrating these things can be.
Very good point as well. And I'm curious, what do you think? How can we move past this? So of course, I think we agree on this problem. I guess in the Netherlands, we've seen this as well. But I think the tricky part is, how do we get to a productive state to move past this instead of just being angry about it? I see a lot of people that are angry from all sides about it, and I understand that frustration, but it's not going to get you very much if that's all you have to offer.
I think that's a tricky thing. I think in principle, the nice thing to say is for people to sort of leave their ideological strongholds and come together, right, and see things from the other point of view. And it might help for people even like myself to not say things like hating radical leftist mentality, right? These, you know, these things put people off. It's like someone saying that anyone who supports a certain party is racist or white supremacist, and maybe I might support that party, kind of thing. We have to stop these kind of verbal attacks on each other. But sort of on a more ideal scale for me, especially with this kind of demonization of, you know, the Western world and the UK where I live, which is not conducive to social cohesion, I think there has to be a crucial move to reclaim the narrative surrounding Western culture and history. So if that's people from the left, that's sort of really presenting or appreciating a balanced view of Western civilization. And if it's people on the right, more on the right side of the argument, maybe not being so timid to be proud of the West, right? Whether this is not a racial thing. You can be white and be proud of the UK, the Western society, and you can be a person that looks like me and be proud. I mean, I live here, so, you know, I have to find ways to appreciate the full story of the Western world. Yes, acknowledging and realizing it had flaws, you know, colonialism, slavery, whatever, but also achieving and celebrating its achievements, right? Advancement of human rights globally, democracy, technological progress. And I think also we have to really look at what's going on in our education system, right? What are our children learning, right? Schools and universities, they really have to show and teach a balanced history, right? That includes the positive contributions of the Western world. And yes, also its darker chapters, but it can't just be about the dark chapters. And I think this will really allow young people to appreciate, you know, their heritage without feeling sort of guilty or ashamed about it.
Yes, there's quite some things to unpack there. I agree with you that if you go what I call inclusive patriotism, which means it doesn't mean that there's just one ethnicity who can be a patriot of whatever Western country it be. In your case, it can be the UK. In my case, it would be the Netherlands. I agree that this is a good starting point. I'm curious, you're saying, I think rightfully so, that in education we are almost demoralizing people to say that the Western world, with all its values, it's not even worth saving at this point because it's so inherently systemically racist. It's only colonialism. It's only bad things. How do you say we need to combine, let's say, the teaching the good and the bad, but then the question becomes, how could we put it in perspective for younger people? Because there might be people listening that will be saying, yes, maybe the West did some good things, like liberal democracy and whatnot. But a lot of people find it hard, I feel, to get over what they've been fed as you could say, the unforgivable sins of the Western past.
Well, I can only speak for how I overcame that feeling by knowing the histories of other nations, by knowing the atrocities of what other nations did. I researched, the history of my own nation, Nigeria, and how heavily involved they were in the slave trade and how reluctant they were that even after the abolition, they were still insistent on practicing slavery, right? And particularly about slavery, this is what people want to focus on, as not wanting to move past it. If you want to just focus on what happened 300-400 years ago, and then you ignore what is actually happening today, particularly in the Middle East in terms of slavery, then you're just a hypocrite and you're being disingenuous. Because as recent as 2023, there were apps on Android and Apple Store where you could buy and sell slaves, right? Black people, right?
Crazy.
This is as recent as 2 years ago. So I personally won't take you seriously. And again, if you want to come with me with that, well, it's because of the legacy of what the Western world did, then I'm going to have to call you stupid again, right? Because, how dare you deny the agency and the autonomy of anyone that's not white again? So that's what I can speak for myself, because I was, like many people 5 years ago, bombarded about these narratives of how irrevocably evil the Western world was. And I was like, well, I'm not a white person. I'm a Black person. Does that mean that there was no, bad parts to my own history? I can't believe that as a rational human being. And I looked into the history, and it doesn't excuse what the Western world, did in parts, but it does bring, like I mentioned, a fuller story, to the picture of the past, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. You could say one person's sin doesn't speak for someone else's or of a country, of course, but indeed it puts it into perspective. I think always an ironic example is, and also a tragic one, like a lot of people now associate, for example, progressiveness with, let's say, electrical cars, right? And whatever you think about them, that's not even the point. But if you think about how some of these minerals are basically produced in African countries like Congo, with basically something that you could say is modern slavery of children in many cases, then there's this irony, right, of what we could nowadays call progressive, or some people call progressive. Slavery in some sense, like you said yourself with the example of these apps, did not stop. And you could say that there are many non-Western countries that are sadly also contributing to this.
Exactly. And what was I going to say? You mentioned Congo.
And the electrical cars and the irony of how this is progressive.
Yes. And that's why I meant about, if you want to go down that route and you don't acknowledge the atrocities that are going, the barbarity that's going on in many non-Western nations, then you are being disingenuous. And for me, you're being performative. It's all performative, right? And it's almost like you ask, then what is the real goal? What is the real intention of why they are demonizing the Western world? And sorry, I really forgot my train of thought, but I was thinking about something quite important I wanted to say on the back of that. It might come back to me later.
It'll come back later. And I'm also curious what you think. There's this underneath a lot of what we're seeing now with this racism. One of the main criticisms from the right, I would say, is that it's also somewhat racist, this whole Black Lives Matter movement with affirmative action. Like you already said yourself, if you say that all white people now are bad, then that is somehow normalized. But if you would say that all black people are bad, and rightfully so, that would not be normalized. So what do you think about that? There's also, in this anti-racist movement, there seems to also be quite some racism somehow.
Oh, there is definitely a lot of racism. And someone, Coleman Hughes, I think he said something like that. There was a course, in an American course, or, a subject that was demonizing all white people. And then it's on the idea of, well, they need to, they are the oppressors. So you're punching up, and that's completely wrong, because we are all human beings. And what these culture wars have done, it's compartmentalized us. It's put us in these neat little boxes that we can't move. It's not fluid, right? We can't move from these boxes. So if I have my skin color, I can never have been privileged, right? If I say that racism hasn't stopped me, I will be told that I am an exception. And then it becomes a thing of, well, how many more exceptions do there need to be for you to realize that this is actually a normal thing, right? Not all black people are oppressed, and not all white people have experienced privilege in their life. And to insist on this is dehumanizing, actually, because you are not appreciating the full story of people, right? It seems that the lived experiences of certain people are valid, right? So I think it's very problematic, and it makes people like myself, who may perhaps want to, what's the word? They don't want you to make their own life story small, because I know so many people who have, like myself, who have experienced great things. I have people in my family who are doctors in the UK. I'm talking in the UK, right? And because they've bought into this narrative that they're oppressed, they can't even celebrate their own success, their journey, the effort that they made to be who they are today, because they feel, well, that's not fair on people perhaps who are not in the same situation as me. And that's so limiting. That's really boring.
Yes, and you undermine yourself, like you said yourself. If you have the mindset, oh, I was just lucky to be in the situation, when of course in anything there can be a little bit of luck, but most of it is also a lot of hard work and determination, then I think it's not very inspiring to young people. And this is what I already said before. I see a lot of demoralized young people, sadly, all throughout the West. And I'm curious if you said in the beginning of this conversation that, this, of course, in this whole culture war, you see now that more of the, let's say, the anti-woke movement is gaining some steam in the West, politically as well, but also culturally. Sometimes it can also be a little bit unnuanced, of course. Let's put that out there. But are you hopeful that we can move past this in the upcoming future, and that we can sort of normalize again and depolarize this issue?
I think so. I think things come and go. That's just the reality of how existence works. I think the more people, because that's what happened to me. I had to experience and sort of research other sides of the story. And I think the more important thing is that people are seeing already that what's being said doesn't match their own reality. And they're also seeing that there are bigger issues to be worried about, right? Such as, which I guess is still part of the culture war, but, the tightening of social resources, which a lot of people might blame on immigration and stuff. And that is an aspect of the culture war. But I think there are, when I certainly speak to some people on the ground, I think they have bigger things that they're thinking about rather than the identity of, whoever, right? They're thinking of how they're going to pay their bills, how they're going to raise their children, in making sure that they're able to hold their political leaders, into account. These things are a tiny bit more important than sort of the gender wars and, you know, sometimes even the race wars that go on. And I think the more people are connected, which is the bigger thing, you know, with the implementation of things like VR in the future, AI, all these things might blend the categories a little bit. And that is what we really need, because right now we're all kind of siloed into these, you know, distinct ideological camps. So I think it might be, I know definitely a lot of young people, you know, they're not so much as interested in this as we might think, right? Those who are fully connected into the media world, you know, in their TikTok phases and stuff, they're just exposed to so many things, and they're smarter than we give them credit for.
That's a fair point. I also agree that it's in a sense it's a waste of all our time that we need to talk about these in some ways non-issues, or if we need to talk about pronouns or all these things of the culture. You were saying that when there are serious things going on in the world, both economically, geopolitically, there are more important things, you could say, for both for our nations, but also, of course, for us as individuals.
I guess the only thing I might say on the back of that, and why it might not be a waste of time in a sense, because I will contradict myself a little bit. There is still, like I think you mentioned, there is still a demoralization of our young people, though, because there's nothing that they feel attached to. And that is the constant belittling and demonizing and downplaying of the Western world. There is a national and so geopolitical risk in that, because how can you deter external sort of actors? You know, how can you protect yourself against, you know, non-state actors and so on, if you don't have people that will defend or who will, you know, come forward to fight your fight, right? To fight your battles. Exactly. I'm not pro-war or anything like that, but it is a reality and that we need to come to terms to. If there is no strong cohesion, like, as much as I may have disagreed with a lot of the COVID policies that, you know, happened a few years ago, but one thing I did see that we know happened is that a lot of people came together, right? Because they found a common purpose. But if there is no common purpose because that was a health risk, right? People were really worried about themselves and their loved ones. But if you're now expanding that out to being worried about a nation, are you really going to find that willingness? I don't think so.
That's a fair point. Also, I didn't mean that it's a waste to talk about it, because only in an ideal world we will not have to deal with these issues. But I agree, we are still living in our reality where these are indeed still things that have an impact on the real world, especially on young people, like we agreed. And so we need to clear the air, you could say, in some ways, so we can move past it. But we're not there yet. And I'm quite curious. You already mentioned also that you're trying to have these kind of like conversations, not only as an individual, but also as an organization. Can you tell me a little bit more about what do you sense when you discuss this with other people? Are you getting a lot of pushback? Are you getting a lot of people supporting you? What has been your experience?
In the beginning, it was really difficult, more difficult, I would say, especially when I was sort of doing it on my own individually, just kind of on my social media, having these conversations, both with, yes, white liberals, they say, and also Black people. It was very difficult to kind of actually, let's think of it. You don't have to agree, but let's just think about it this way. I think now what I really like about how the climate of things, especially doing the work I do, I think there's a willingness now to at least talk about it. There's a willingness to kind of, you still have, you know, the fringe pushback of people who are kind of really stuck in what they believe and think, right? You know, but I think there is that willingness to engage on very hot button topics, right? And that's something I definitely didn't see before. I think people have had enough of being told what to think. And I think people have seen a lot of flaws and weaknesses in mainstream conversations, in the mainstream media. They've obviously seen, you know, 5 years of, you know, we like this word misinformation, but a lot of misinformation has come out from our TV screens, from people who were, you know, made themselves the gatekeepers of truth. And we've seen that a lot of stuff that came out of these news outlets were not truth. And that's why the rise of, independents, like I believe yourselves and us as well, yes. We are really filling that gap of people who are, who want something different.
Definitely. I can relate very much to that, because it's also the kind of responses that we are getting. We, over the last 3 years, we also miraculously almost we grew a lot because of this this feeling that you're also describing. And I'm also curious, then, if people want to follow you and your organization, where can they do that?
So we're pretty much everywhere, maybe except TikTok. If you just type in the Equiano Project, if you type in my name as well, Ada Akpala, you'll probably see a link to the Equiano Project. So we're on Facebook, we have our website. We do have an upcoming event next month where we'll be talking about Islam and liberal democracies. Unfortunately, it's a public in-person event, so I don't know if your base will be able to attend that. But we do put on a lot of events as well. So sometimes they're virtual. So I definitely encourage people who are interested in these conversations, not just about racial identity, but identity in general, the Western identity, and so on, to check us out.
That's very great. It has been lovely to have this conversation with you. So thank you for your time to come on. And yes, I also want to, of course, thank our listeners. If you feel like you want to make these kind of conversations possible, then please consider becoming a member at nieuwrechts.nl. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was fun.